Hi, my name is Stephanie Stillo, and I'm a curator in the Rare Book and Special Collections Division, and I am delighted to welcome you to another segment of From the Vaults. So one of the most extraordinary parts of the Airmount Library is the beautiful collection of different kinds of bindings. And to talk about those bindings a little bit more, we are joined by the chief of the Rare Books and Special Collections Division, Mark Demunation, who is going to give us some wonderful examples. So Mark, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, glad to be here. And I must say, this is a very interesting and exciting part of the Airmount collection, and one that people might not have come to expect given the much grander design bindings that we find in the Airmount collection. So what we have here is a sampling of what amounts to 19 Sangorsky and Sutcliffe bindings that we found in the Airmount collection. Sangorsky and Sutcliffe were binders that started in the early 20th century in England and became known for treasure-like bindings, heavy design, lots of gold work, lots of onlay. And were productive throughout the 20th century. We have samples of their work here, give us an opportunity to explore their work a little bit. And of those 19 bindings, we have a good run. Those 19 bindings are added to what we already have in the Rare Book collection, which means we now have 43 Sangorsky and Sutcliffe bindings here at the Library of Congress, which is a real treasure trove.
Not bad.
You know, it's not bad at all, and very exciting to talk about.
Okay.
So let's start with something that's a little bit perhaps unexpected for Sangorsky and Sutcliffe, although it's really their bread and butter work. We'll take a look at one of the editions and I'll talk a little bit about how they got started. So if you can hand me this volume right here. This is a work of Ayn Rand. So we're already dealing with late 20th century.
Yes.
And far past the actual input of Mr. Sangorsky and Mr. Sutcliffe. But it does talk about the endurance of the firm over the 20th century. And this is what we would call a collector's binding or an edition, a collector's binding of a literary edition. It's not an edition binding by any stretch of the imagination. We'll talk a little bit about it. But it's a rather plain representative of what is otherwise a firm that's quite noted for its elaborate book bindings.
Yeah.
So what we're looking at is the bread and butter of the firm.
So, Mark, tell me who these men are. How did this firm evolve?
They met, Francis Sangorsky and George Sutcliffe met each other in 1896 in London. They were both taking bookbinding classes at the Central London School for Arts and Crafts and became familiar with each other through their work. In 1898, they both won fellowships that allowed them to pursue their work as bookbinders. They both got hired by a man named Cockerell, who was a very noted bookbinder at the time, and even more importantly, was a mentor ultimately to many significant bookbinders of the 20th century. They worked for him for a couple of years. Francis Sangorsky worked as a forwarder. Forwarder is somebody who receives the book sewn and forwards it in terms of creating the binding that wraps the book so that when he's done, the book is bound and is turned over to the gold finisher, which is what George Sutcliffe was studying to be. In 1901, because of a coal strike, among other things, there was an economic slump and both of them found themselves unemployed. And in a field that's both difficult to make a living in and a little bit expensive to start up, they formed their own firm, Sangorsky and Sutcliffe, in 1901. 10 years later, they were the most influential binder of the Edwardian period. So in 10 short years, this combination of their skills had them rise to the top in terms of a bespoke trade for hand bookbinding. Sangorsky, much more involved with design and finishing and the artistic nature of the books. And Sutcliffe, although he had talent, was very much business-minded, and the two of them together were a perfect combination. In 1905, they moved around for quite a while as their firm continued to grow, and in 1905, Sutcliffe's brother Alberto joined them for 5 years. He brought to the firm a skill for illuminating manuscripts, taking vellum manuscripts and illuminating them in the medieval style. So that by 1910, Sangorsky and Sutcliffe was famous for a detailed, heavily elaborated, jeweled binding with original vellum manuscripts inside. This is not a bookbinder for the masses.
Yeah.
This is not about a democratic approach to bookbinding. This was very much for the carriage trade.
Yeah.
They worked with very expensive materials. Probably the most influential of all the bindings ever created by Sangorsky and Sutcliffe was something that Francis Sangorsky began. It took him 2 years to complete, which he did in 1910, which was an elaborately detailed binding of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, which had a heavily paneled front cover with many layers. Over 1,000 jewels were attached to this cover. It took 2 years to make. It was referred to as the Great Omar.
Yeah.
It was sent off to this book. It was jinxed from the beginning. It was sent to America because they believed it would fetch a much better price in auction. It was stopped by English customs and sent back, much to their dismay. So it went up for auction in London, never met the minimum price of £1,000 that they were asking, and was sold, ironically, to an American for £450. In order to deliver it, they wrapped it and had it placed in a vault, which was loaded on the Titanic.
Oh, no.
So the Great Omar lies at the bottom of the sea in 1912 and was never to be seen again. In a bit of dark poetry, Francis Sangorsky drowned several weeks later and left the firm in George Sutcliffe's hands. So George Sutcliffe rallied, kept the firm alive, brought in other partners, expanded the notion of binding a little bit. It increased the bread and butter binding of the production of the firm. It continued to grow. It morphed over the years. It survived 2 world wars, a depression, economic ups and downs, got acquired by firms, disappeared, and then reappeared. And in 1998, the name Sangorsky and Sutcliffe reappeared on the scene again as a binder.
Interesting. So, Mark, tell me what we have here. Let's go ahead and start on this side of the table, and we'll move along.
Sure. So these are just a few examples of, you could find many Sangorsky and Sutcliffe bindings like this. As I mentioned earlier, even though they're famous for heavily designed bindings, they produced a lot of these collector's bindings. They're simple, they're straightforward. We have selected works by Conrad, Tolstoy, Fitzgerald, and Ayn Rand. So you get a full run of the century of authors that the firm has produced over time. Obviously, only the earlier ones would ever be in contact with the real Sangorsky and Sutcliffe. These bindings serve a certain purpose. They're for gentlemen's collections, if you will, or collections in general. They fly in the face of bibliophilic collecting. A collector who's serious about literature or serious about editions would never do this to a book. They would never strip off the covers and the dust jacket and change its appearance. This is meant to look good on the shelf with all your other books which look the same. It is beautifully done. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The materials are very high end, and it's quite a luxurious treatment. But it's very different from the condition of books you would find if somebody collected, say, Steinbeck or Fitzgerald, for example.
Right. So tell me what we have then over here.
These are slightly more elaborate versions of what we were looking at in terms of collector's bindings. Sangorsky and Sutcliffe did a lot of business doing fine bindings for sets. And as you know, the Aramont collection has an extraordinary run of finely bound collected works, which is an unusual collecting area in its own right. I have 2 selected here. One is Forster's book on Dickens, which is actually a 3-volume work, but has been exploded into 6 volumes. I'll talk about that in a minute. And the other is Longfellow's memoir. Both of these are extra illustrated, and that's why 3 volumes become 6. Extra illustrated books was a bit of a promotion and also a bit of a hobby that was present in the period of time. Collectors would buy a book with extra blank pages bound in between the text. And those pages would be the surfaces on which they would affix images, manuscripts, prints, photographs, anything that related to the text on that page to sort of illustrate the book further. So 3 volumes is blown into 6 to allow you to collect and represent. So here, for example, in the Dickens work, is actually a real illustration clipped from a Dickens work that's now been glued into this book.
Yeah.
And we'll see prints from the period, sometimes autograph letters, and other things, so that it becomes extra illustrated. If it's done by the collector, we sometimes call them Grangerized books. You'll also notice that it's not just the interior binding that receives treatment, but the doublures also receive treatment from the binders. But again, the only thing that distinguishes these is they tend to be a bit more ornamental on the spine from the straightforward collector's editions.
Wonderful. So I have been waiting this whole time to ask about these bindings up front. So can we please go ahead and dive into this?
Well, sure. And this is exactly what everyone envisions when you hear somebody talk about a Sangorski and Sutcliffe binding. These are 4 examples from a much larger collection of the decorated bindings produced by Sangorski and Sutcliffe. All of these are editions from the 19th century, so these are likely books that went through the original firm from 1901 to 1910. We have a Robert Browning, an Amy Lowell book of poems. We have an H.G. Wells with a very unusual illustration on the cover showing the invisible man in his bathrobe, being invisible, of course, and also Percy Shelley's Prometheus Unbound. Each of them have characteristics that speak to the skill and the craftsmanship of Sangorski and Sutcliffe. Elaborate, detailed gold tooling, inlay. Anywhere that you see color in this binding, the red roses, the color of the leaves, are small bits of leather that have been inlaid into the binding and tooled around to make it level with the surface of the binding. And in this case, we have 4 semi-precious stones, 1 in each of the corners, with a lovely sort of central motif of roses and vines and trumpet vines, all decorating Amy Lowell's poems called Dream Drops.
When it hits the light, it almost looks like embroidery.
And when you do a close-up, you realize how exquisitely detailed these small bits of tooling are. Now, these are produced with a variety of tools. There is, of course, especially with gold work, you have tools that allow you to pull a straight line with gold tooling, but you also have all of these stamps that you're stamping tooling. So it's a very elaborate pattern that's laid on top of this leather, and it's a fairly sophisticated process. They vary in style from more of a wide open grid to an all-over pattern, but it's very characteristic of Sangorski and Sutcliffe.
Beautiful. So one of the most extraordinary bindings in the Airmount Library is this incredible Raven binding. So let's talk about that.
Happy to. This is really in the spirit of the famous Peacock binding, the Great Omar, and actually equally scarce. This is a production, again, done by the original team of Sangorski and Sutcliffe. It's called the Raven binding because it is a binding for an illuminated vellum manuscript copy of Edgar Allan Poe. What we have here is a heavily tooled and jeweled, there are 43 jewels on this binding, the raven in front of a blue jar surrounded by all-over patterning, which gets even more extraordinary on the back in a way. Remembering that each of these blue and green diamond shapes are actually leather inlay that's been tooled around to create this effect. The book itself contains an illuminated vellum manuscript of Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. It was done by Alberto Sutcliffe, brother of George Sutcliffe. Although it's not signed by him, we know that it's the case because the portrait of Poe has an A.S. in the corner, telling us who did it. And this is the moment of Sangorski and Sutcliffe. This is what they brought to Edwardian England that no one else could provide. These extraordinary illuminated manuscripts of contemporary works and these extraordinary bindings. This is a very precious piece, in part because Alberto was a little upset with his family. He left the firm in 1910 because although the bindings are all very carefully labeled, illuminated and bound by Sangorski and Sutcliffe, London, His name is not mentioned anywhere, and he left in a huff in 1910. And to make matters worse, signed on with Riviere Bindings, who were the competitor bindings at the period of time. They were more than happy to have Alberto Sutcliffe join their team. But of all the bindings representing this firm, this is the most extraordinary in terms of books that I have seen. It has all of the decoration and inspiration that we find in a peacock binding, but it's played out even further because of this sort of odd American connection to Edgar Allan Poe, and is really an extraordinary piece of work.
Yeah.
So this has been a very quick tour of a rather elaborate set of bindings that we find in the Aramont collection. It's been a real joy to be able to present the Sandgorski and Sutcliffe bindings to you. They represent so much more than just craft. They tell us something about the time and culture that produces them and helps us understand not only book collecting, but reading and style and aesthetics in the early and mid 20th century in England. Thank you for joining us for this glimpse of the Aramont collection here at the Library of Congress, and look forward to seeing you again at another episode of From the Vaults.